How I Could Have Become Antifa. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and due to the recent happenings in my birthplace of the Pacific Northwest, both regarding Andy Ngo's brutal and near-fatal beating in Portland this weekend, as well as the targeted harassment and violent attacks towards a poorly publicized channel that goes by the name of Operation Cold Front, who specializes in provocative but mostly civil conversations in Seattle, I want to remind people a bit about my past, as it's been a while. I grew up in Seattle, and I mean in Seattle. In fact, I was literally born on Capitol Hill, which is the cultural mecca of all of Seattle, and I grew up there for my first 12 years until my mother could no longer afford the home my father bought for her in the late 60s or early 70s, inspiring us to move to other places within the Seattle city limits. Capitol Hill is the same place that Antifa has plastered flyers all over that target Operation Cold Front's non-violent security guard.
So what y'all doing? Y'all do like a YouTube channel?
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. We're just going around trying to the far left and the far right, not even the far right, just the Republican and Democratic parties right now in the political scene are completely separated. There's hard to really bridge that gap. So we actually they made a YouTube channel. I do security for them. Our other host isn't here. So tonight I'm going to be filling in just to do a little bit of commentary because my name, I live in this neighborhood. My name has been slandered by Antifa, which I don't even think I have the flyer anymore at this point.
What is that shit again? That's the
anti-fascist. So they call themselves.
So they put these. I had a gentleman rip half of it up, but that's my name. I ripped on 101 of these. Four of them said to kill me. And so, like,
that's insane.
Yeah. So I actually have a harassment suit going with the police department right now. We're trying to figure out who's the one putting these flyers up and writing that. It's getting to a point where I've been jumped now, leaving bars because I do security for these guys. And all we really do, yes, we're a little controversial.
Why people got so many problems with your shit then?
Because we're a Republican YouTube channel. We're not a liberal or Democratic. And the thing is we try to provoke a conversation. So like our other host, he's a Muslim Republican, he's black, and they made a sign that says it's okay to be white. So when people see that, they're carrying that like, oh, you guys are white supremacists. Wait, you're black and Muslim. How is that possible?
As you can gather from the footage, the security guard is actually the only white guy on camera that is regularly present while the hosts are filming. One host is black, and the other is a North African or Middle Eastern guy who is actually a right-wing Muslim, something I'd never heard of before. Suffice it to say, I think we can make an educated guess about why they aren't even targeting an actual host with such extended harassment, though they did dox the Muslim guy.
Don't hurt
Yeah,
me.
brother.
Just go,
Yeah, you little white little
go.
fucker.
Really?
No.
Yeah. You're a fucking little whitey, aren't you?
Clearly, we can all agree that this is very messed up, and I can assure you guys that even when I was 15 years old and a leftist gay kid that was terrified of all conservatives and most straight men, as this was back in the 90s when anti-gay violence and rhetoric was severely more common in schools, even then, I would have always opposed this. However, for the most part, while the relatively sensible gay dudes in the Seattle area wouldn't want to go anywhere near most violence of any type, they still almost unanimously believe that Antifa are the good guys that they merely don't agree with the tactics of. And more so, they genuinely believe that right-wing people are more violent, prompting them to assume without evidence or sincere doubt that guys like Operation Cold Front, Patriot Prayer, and the Proud Boys initiate the physicality. Just a few weeks ago, there was a completely unsubstantiated and obviously untrue copy and pasted chain message on Facebook, undoubtedly originating from Antifa, that there had been a Proud Boy sighting on Capitol Hill, and that supposedly the Proud Boys had declared that they would be searching for queers to beat up, or whatever. Of course, I know that this was untrue because I watch YouTube constantly and know what the Proud Boys and their gay members are all about. But of course, leftists in urban meccas absolutely don't watch political YouTube, aside from maybe their monthly ContraPoints fix, because they spend all their time going to bars. Thus, I didn't try to get through to them because I've learned through experience that there is no reasoning with these people, as they are genuinely afraid for their safety, and they'll become furious if you even try to calm them down. Usually when these things happen on Facebook, there's always generally going to be some lying Antifa who's reading that will try to claim to have been attacked unprovoked by the Proud Boys. And if I try to say that I've never seen any evidence of that, they will threaten me and call me a coward for not showing my face publicly on Facebook. Like, actually being afraid for my safety for a good reason makes me a coward when I don't want to get in fights? So yeah, it's usually not worth bothering to try to alleviate this deep-seated fear within my gay peers. Yes, it's at best a completely misplaced fear due to the fact that, as anybody who has watched the Seattle local news documentary Seattle is Dying knows, there's all sorts of very regular violent attacks in Seattle, and queers, or gay people, do regularly get targeted to be beat up and robbed due to the rampant drug-related crimes and even gang violence from people who come from out of town, just from a few suburbs over, to jack a few people and then drive back to their cheaper and more dangerous suburb. More so, and much more difficult to undo, these people have a complete and utter fear of non-far leftist American towns and cities, coming from people who almost unanimously haven't been to them for numerous years, if ever. After thinking about it for a while, I realized that I can actually relate to this feeling of paranoia, disdain, and finding irrational ways of blaming both others who have done nothing wrong to you for your own problems, while simultaneously blaming oneself for problems that were never even really your fault, simply due to the completely irrational and nonsensical social behavior that has been normalized for generations in cities like Seattle. And so, the point of this video begins now. Being born in the early 1980s in such an area, to a family full of gendered tensions from a feminist mother and a father 11 years older than she, who remembered a time when women didn't tend to act so consistently horrible while being encouraged by media like Ms. Magazine to do so, my worldview became warped as soon as I began being able to hear, see, and remember things. On this channel, in fact, I have often told stories of me being bullied by my sister who was 2 years older than I was when I was about 2 or 3 years old and couldn't even really speak well, as she'd pin me on my back while I cried out to no answer from my parents, prompting me to struggle free enough to hit her, only to be spanked when she'd fake tears. Perhaps it was because I was the last child and a definite unwanted pregnancy. Perhaps it was because my parents were both too lazy and too stressed out to care at that point. And of course, perhaps it was because I was a boy. More than one thing can be true at once, of course, because I'm pretty sure it was all three. However, the important thing to keep in mind is that ever since the sexual revolution and the rise of second-wave feminism, there were countless situations of young males in similar situations to those I was born into during the 1980s, and to a lesser degree, girls, as even though parents didn't have a high predisposition to judge their female gender as a negative trait and literally steal their action figures and give them to thrift stores without telling us the way my mother did, well, they still had bad parents, even if they were favored by their bad feminist parents. By the time I was in the 5th grade, I was undoubtedly starting to sound more and more gay to many of the people around me, which I assure you was completely natural due to my upbringing. Being that my mother and my sisters deeply hated men, I even hated my father at a young age, and then adding the fact that a gay male moved into my house when I was just about 10, it was natural to want to emulate him and his friends' speaking patterns. They were the only men the women in my family didn't hate, after all. Of course, being a gay kid that also picked up on numerous traits that tend to be a lot more common in the worst types of females, I got teased a lot in middle school and it was terrible. I was loud, chubby, and I always snapped back, which oddly actually worked out in my favor generally, as it made the tougher kids at my 80% black middle school laugh, so kids didn't ever full-on jump me. However, it was still a very rough environment, and kids in different grades, or ones I just didn't know, would still try to trip me, push me from behind, and occasionally run past and try to steal something from me, because they did that to every white male in the hallway. That stuff, combined with the relentless teasing, made me terrified of going to the high school with about 2,000 or 3,000 students, where there had been numerous shootings in recent years. Thus, I opted into going to the alternative high school that only had about 200 students, whose classes started no earlier than 9 a.m. Yay! At that point, my life felt fairly awesome. I was free to entirely be myself, minus that it wasn't kosher to be rude to any of the other students, which was actually really difficult for me because I had a sharp tongue and I was used to really vicious kids from middle school. But it was great because I was not just allowed to come out of the closet after a month or two, but I was downright celebrated in the exact same way transgender students clearly are in the current year at leftist schools. The gay kids got away with a lot more negative behavior as the teachers tried so hard to be patient. And the teachers really liked me because I could talk with them like they were my friends. I've made a video about this phenomenon, in fact, as it never even occurred to me until recently how much compensatory privilege I was given at my school from the teachers, and I figured that this was just how people were to gay kids, due to the fact that most of the adults I knew anywhere else in Seattle that I was around a bunch treated gay people similarly at the time. It was the PC 90s when gay men needed special treatment because we were all dying of AIDS or something. I just figured that people were nice to gay people because they knew how hard it was to find dates as a gay teenager and how much fear I had for my safety at the bus stop in the black neighborhood or something. I was clueless. Worse, due to the completely bizarre doublethink, rampant hypocrisy, sexism, racism, and completely selective compassion that morally ruled that very far leftist public school, by the end of my time there, I was what I would estimate to be about 50% brainwashed into thinking that this type of behavior was actually ethically acceptable, to the point where I didn't even realize I was engaging in some of it. Sure, I didn't really believe every stupid thing that the postmodern, feminist, quasi-Marxist who surrounded me said, such as how it's fine when Islamic people beat their wives or something because it's a cultural difference, or how the fact that a fetus was in a woman's sacred body was supposedly the be-all and end-all factor in determining whether the fetus was a human organism or not. I knew these things were kinda pushing it, but I did learn to see these arguments as completely normal. However, even though I did know those things were kinda dumb, there were all sorts of things that I did almost entirely grow to internalize, likely due to the fact that, well, I found a way to benefit from them. For example, the school was rampantly full to the brim with those smug and absurdly condescending types of passive-aggressive insults that we can now see so commonly from essentially everybody in the entire left, especially on media, every time they talk about anything besides maybe yoga. For a while, these people did make me really angry because, in case you haven't actually been around black people before, which I had been in middle school, passive-aggressive insults do not fly with black people, and you generally get an immediate, "The fuck you say to me? I'm gonna let you know right now that if you get smart with me like that again, you're gonna get socked in the jaw," type of reaction. And honestly, I related to black people in that way, as I saw how patronizing white leftist kids often were to them. However, once I realized that as an openly gay teenager at the super accepting alternative high school, I could always get away with that type of behavior, I grew accustomed to behaving that way. Thus, long story short, I ended up compromising a lot of my inherent principles, accepting illogic as completely normal, and basically becoming an entitled brat that couldn't imagine making myself happy by working on my own shortcomings that pissed people off. But then, eventually, I kind of snapped out of it when I went to school in New York City for college. And over the course of a few years, due to the fact that I wanted to have any friends at all that I actually had things in common with, I needed to at least try to behave like a rational and fair person. And I did manage to get better at it while I was there. People in New York City come from everywhere, and native New Yorkers have about the lowest bullshit tolerance of any liberal city. Thus, being confronted with thousands and thousands of people that were actually very intelligent and didn't act like those in Seattle, I learned to evolve my behavior. However, a weird thing happened while I was there, which was that due to the profound cultural disconnect between myself and my home area of the Pacific Northwest, I eventually started internalizing the idea that maybe I was the weird one, that maybe I was even fully crazy, mainly due to the fact that everybody in New York is kind of crazy just from living in such a loud environment that has so many people everywhere where the apartments are all small. So I started thinking maybe people in Seattle are kind of more sane. Maybe people in New York all have issues. Granted, this coincided with many complicated and specific events which contributed to this full-blown succumbing into being gaslit by my upbringing. And so, the deal was sealed when ultimately I realized that I wasn't happy living in an extremely loud, stressful, dirty, hot, cold, smelly, air-polluted, expensive city, and thus moved back to Seattle for 2 years. And then I deeply tried to convince myself that I was the one with the problem all along, throwing out everything I had learned about becoming a better person in New York City in favor of acting like my peers in Seattle. It was only then that my life went dramatically into a downward spiral. I turned to drugs and alcohol very excessively to dumb myself down, due to the fact that I knew I was a better person than how I was acting and all the people around me were acting, and I knew I was compromising my integrity by even hanging out with half of the people I was around. I fell back into blaming all of my unhappiness on other people, and that's what everybody in the Pacific Northwest does, including taking out all of their frustrations very often on their own friends mercilessly, because part of one of the essential side effects of living in a social reality built upon postmodernism is the notion that people should be allowed to rationalize away everything that inconveniences you or your own conception of what the world should be like, especially in regards to making you happy. As I grew to become a more and more miserable person, I surrounded myself with more and more miserable people, and then a particular thing happened that's very common in all of these types of cities. I found that the only people who claimed to like these cities, in terms of people that I knew, were generally gay people or other veritable freaks of any type who came from small towns or other conservative areas. Seriously, every miserable Seattleite, which is most Seattleites, openly admits to hating Seattle, but there's some that say, oh, but it's so much better than where I'm from. These types of people always told me, yeah, it's awful in my conservative town. I'm never moving back. Kind of like how I described in this video about San Francisco. And they'd lament about how horrible their life was in Eastern Washington or something right before they took their 5th shot of whiskey. And of course, after convincing myself that all of this was normal, I had no ability to relate or converse with conservative people at all, even when they liked me perfectly well and were perfectly nice to me. I simply grew to entirely believe that conservative towns and even most conservative people must be even worse than this horrible city that I was living in, because maybe my pink-haired, nasal voice, coke-addicted gay friend swore it was true, and it was convenient for me to believe him. One time, an old friend of mine had a friend that I hung out with that worked for a Republican congressperson or something, who said she thought I was great and really liked me. But due to the fact that I simply didn't find her particularly interesting in a way that would have actually changed my mind, though certainly not mean or anything, I decided that she must be a horrible person that I never wanted to see again because of her job. That was my sincere outlook. And so, thinking about all of that, I have to wonder, could I have ended up Antifa? This mental condition I was afflicted with got worse and worse over time, every time I spent prolonged periods of time in the Pacific Northwest, and I genuinely believe with all of my heart that the only reason I didn't progressively get worse and worse my whole life was because I learned how to communicate effectively with both conservatives and people from around the world while I was in New York and also later on YouTube. In a lot of ways, it wasn't really so bad during my time in San Francisco because people are a tiny bit more honest in San Francisco. But of course, there's plenty of problems there too with other social factors. Regardless, if I had never left Seattle, would I now be terrified of conservative groups I know nothing about, all because of rumors? If I had never become a YouTube addict and stayed an alcoholic, I can assume so. More so, would I have friends that ended up as Antifas? Well, duh, that happened anyway. Even worse, let's say I stayed a junkie. Might I have gotten so desperate for money or something that I'd end up looking into a paid position as a leftist protester on Craigslist? I don't know. I really don't know. And that's the troubling part. That's all I have to say for this video. Please share this around if you found it insightful, as after being demonetized, as in my whole channel, I think I can rest assured that it's the only way for this video to spread, and very much please do send me tips on PayPal and Subscribestar, as YouTube is still somehow my best source of income due to all of you amazing viewers who do give me great donations. I'm going to the International Conference for Male Issues in August. So, yeah, that would help. And also make sure to follow me on BitChute and Minds.